Welcome to the Iron John Podcast. I'm Timothy Young with the Minnesota Men's Conference organizers. On October 7th, 2025, we will return to Camp Miller on Sturgeon Lake in Minnesota for our 41st Fall Conference. While looking back for material to promote the conference, I found this recording from 2012. Some of the teachers at that conference spoke to the history of the conference and looked forward to its future. Those men include the poet Thomas R. Smith, Doug Von Koss, Walton Stanley, Danny Deerdorf, Martin Shaw, and myself. And here is that conversation, watering the ring of the conference tree.
Okay, the way we're going to do this is this. Each of us up here are going to witness or remark upon a certain little personal slice of our history in this. So we're going to be going down the line and each taking a few minutes. And then we're going to open the floor up to the rest of you to bring in what you'd like to bring in. So that'll be the second half of this. This is, let's see, Tim, do you want to say anything before I get going? No? Okay, all right. Well, this is something that we do right now, particularly in light of the fact that Robert Bly is such a founding presence of this conference, but physically not as much with us anymore. Robert will be here for a reading, I believe it's tomorrow night, right? Yeah. Thursday night. But his basis now here with us is primarily as visitor and tutelary spirit. And we can't get enough of him simply as a visitor. So this discussion is also to bring him more fully as a spirit. And soul and intellect into this conference. I'm going to start out by kind of setting the tone of this. The real question that we were batting around earlier was, why did a poet start this thing rolling, this thing that we know now as the mythopoetic men's movement? Why was it a poet? Back in the day, Jeff Wagenheim, who was the editor of New Age Journal and published the famous interview with Keith Thompson that became Robert's great book, Iron John, asked Robert in an interview, well, why a poet? Why not say a sports hero or a politician or or a movie star? This is what Robert told him. I'll read this little quote from the October 1990 New Age Journal interview. Robert said, "One reason poetry is at the center is because the language that men use to communicate with each other has gotten very damaged." And later on in that same interview, he added, "All poetry was originally love poems, and poetry is still a way of appreciating the universe. The part of American men that's been most damaged, is the lover." So, in a nutshell, that's the why of a poet as founder of this institution that we've been helping carry on for all of these years. Excuse me. So one thing you have to also realize, I don't know how much history of the mythopoetic men's work you know individually, but one thing you have to realize is that Robert Bly certainly comes out of the lover tradition. Now, back in the 90s, when Robert Moore published his famous book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, we were talking about all of those types. And actually, Robert Bly, in his prime, was a really fine balance at his best of those four. He had a little bit of each of them in him. But still, where he was coming from primarily in the beginning was the lover. And it had to be that way because, as he always likes to say, the reason that he came into poetry was because his high school English teacher had good legs. So beauty seduced Robert into poetry by way of the lover in him, and that's always been there, right at the center of him. So in the days before the men's work, Robert was primarily interested in the feminine, the divine feminine. So this is what he's grounded in. I think I heard him once paraphrase the biblical saying, no one comes to me except by way of the Father, as no one comes to me except by way of the mother. And that's something that that during the height of Robert's involvement in the men's work, say in that decade of the 90s particularly, it was maybe easy to lose sight of, because Robert, actually being grounded in the feminine, was working very hard, like the rest of us, to develop and honor some part of his masculinity that he hadn't really fully developed. But you saw then in the decade of the 2000s onward more of an arc returning to attention to the mother. If you read his book, The Maiden King, you know that Robert was coming back toward the goddess in that book. So, this is an arc that his life and his work have described, and poetry for him was always at the center of it, because poetry is that, for him, that vehicle of repair by which the part of American men that is most damaged can be repaired. So while he was doing repair on himself, he was also doing repair for us, and I think that's one of the reasons that we're all here. Am I right about that? Yeah. So I wanted to say a couple things also about my first experience of him. Now, when I was a college student in 1969, a couple of teachers, English teachers of mine who were already familiar with Robert's work, herded a bunch of students into a van, and we drove up to Minneapolis, to Kauffman Memorial Union on the University of Minnesota campus, where Robert was appearing with this band of wild poets who were the poets against the Vietnam War. And I didn't know who Robert was before then. And then I saw him up on stage in his serape, and he was a force of nature. He was something volcanic, hurricane-like, tornado-like. And he was an embodiment of the rage that we felt at that time against that war, against the society being sucked into that war. He recited his poem, The Teeth Mother Naked at Last, which is arguably the greatest anti-war poem in America that came out of the Vietnam War. He also recited Mark Twain's War Prayer, which is fantastic, bitter, sardonic piece of American literature. So at that time, I, something in me that was really looking for some grounding in life and in art, immediately recognized Robert as someone who could be a teacher. And a few years later, I got a chance to meet him. And one other thing that you have to realize about Robert at this period was Robert was essentially a star presence in artistic and intellectual circles. So you'd go to a reading of his in Minneapolis, say in the early 70s, and everybody was there. The mayor might have been there. Minneapolis might have been there. Politicians were there. Teachers were there. Robert was like William Blake at that time. He was a prophetic figure. Coleman Barks has an old photograph of him from the 80s, where it looks like literally almost like flame is rising off the top of his head. He was so radiant and so numinous in the center of a room that I remember the first time I worked up the courage to approach him after a reading. My heart was beating so fast that I couldn't hear what I was saying to him. So that's what he was like when many of us at that time met him. Incredible power. And part of it was this moral force of gathering up the popular resistance against the war and speaking it, not only in polemical words, but in words of poetry. That made all the difference. So he elevated that from rhetoric to art. So it was a great thing that he did for us, and we were all very, very grateful for him. I'll just say one more thing about Robert at that time before passing on the baton here. We have to be honest about who Robert was. He was, at that time, a real kettle of roiling forces. And one of the reasons that it was intimidating to meet him was because he had a reputation for really tearing a person down if he didn't like them. I mean, that tongue of poetry that he commanded could also become a tooth or a beak. It could rip you neck to navel if he wanted to do that. And I saw him do that a couple times, and it scared the shit out of me. It probably caused me to not try to get close to him for a long time. So he had that side of him too, and there are still people around Minneapolis that just hate him because, of something that he did to them, 30, 35 years ago. But that ferocity was also a part of his warriorhood, and it's part of what enabled him to go out into the world and break the ground that he did, not only in the anti-war movement, but also in the men's work. So there's no way to separate who Robert has been as a public, active, social figure from who he is as a poet. Those kinds of attempts to break that down are futile because they're all part of the same person. And now he's much diminished in capacity, and we all know that. But what I see right now with Robert is that the lover is still alive in him, and the poet is still alive in him. And you'll hear that tomorrow night. Yeah, you'll hear that tomorrow night in the way he loves to recite to David Whetstone and Marcus Wise, who will be here with him. They just, they bring out a boat that the lover in him floats down the river of their music. So that most essential part of him is still with us, but the other parts are not so much anymore. And I wanted us to recognize and evoke that here today. And I'll pass this on to Tim.
I met Robert when I was in graduate school at some poetry seminars, and he was what I was looking for because I was studying feminist poetry and I just couldn't relate. I was respecting it, but I just couldn't relate. And Robert came in and shifted my vision. In 1984, when I was in a feminist poetry seminar, and I was the only man and was the target of every projection. Yeah, Robert was giving a reading in Minneapolis at Hennepin Methodist Church on Iron John, and it was in February, and many of us in the Twin Cities showed up there. Craig was there, Walton was there, I was there, and Robert went on to tell the Iron John story, and in his inimitable way, just riled us all up. And he says, if you want to do a conference, we did a conference in New Mexico, sign up. And so we signed up. Craig and Doug Padilla grabbed the list, and in September of 1984, we had the first Minnesota Men's Conference at Camp Widgewagon outside of Ely, Minnesota. I knew absolutely no one. I didn't know these gentlemen at the time, but I had been lit on fire by Robert's poetry and the story. It's very important to remember the story also lit us on fire. Showed up there, and there were about 60 of us, not much different than this group right here. Michael Mead was there, Terry Dobson, Craig. We started talking, and it was the first time in my life I ever heard a group of men start talking about their griefs and their wounds among other men. It's like, wow. We started going down. We started sinking. I mean, men felt safe enough to stand up and tell about being sexually abused by their fathers, by going through this difficulty and that difficulty. And I was stunned. And I finally, after 2.5 days, I got enough courage to stand up, and I didn't realize what I was going to say. And I stood up and I said, wow, I haven't had these kind of problems, but I guess I'm here because, and it blurted out, I'm here because my best friend from high school came back from Vietnam and killed himself. Robert says, we have to talk about that. That's the most unspoken statement out there. We have to talk about this. In the whole room, all of a sudden men are standing up and they're crying, they're grieving, and now we're talking about suicides. In 1984, there had been over 80,000 suicides of Vietnam-era vets, 54,000 fatalities in Vietnam. And this doesn't include all of the other statistics, the men who, I had one friend who deliberately drove his motorcycle off the cliff to kill himself when he found out his wife was having an affair on him. It's listed as an accident, not a suicide. So we know that. So we fall into that discussion. We're 15 minutes into that discussion, and a piece of paper is being handed through this discussion, given to Robert. Robert reads it. He says, excuse me, I'll be right back. Yes. He walked out of the room, and we continued our discussion. Robert came back into the room a half hour later, sobbing like I've never seen a man sob. He says, Sam has died. His son Sam had been killed the night before in an accident in his first day at college. Robert had to leave that conference. It's the first Minnesota Men's Conference. We're all there looking for our fathers, looking for our teacher, and our teacher gets pulled out from the middle of us in the deepest, most painful way. And we sat in that grief, and we went deeper and deeper and deeper over that week. We decided to stick it out. Craig and the other teachers decided we're going to continue this. We went down and we mined our griefs. and what happened with men coming together with all of their grief and their suffering and their tears and the anguish that we had, something alchemical happened. Some fire started inside of us that we had never known before. When I left after that week, my fiancée to be my wife, she said, something happened. The instant she saw me, she said, something happened, you're totally different. And the only thing I could say is that what was outside of me, I had been walking my whole life, I'd been outside of myself. Suddenly, the grief and the other men, all of those bears, pushed me back inside of myself. For me, I shook for 3 days like this as I adapted to that. This is how the Minnesota Men's Conference started. It continued for 28 years. There's so many things have happened over all those years. One thing that's important that I want to mention before I pass this on is that in 1994, right out here, it was in the morning, Robert was coming from his home in Moose Lake, and he says, oh, come on down here. We all arrived here, and they brought this enormous black bear that had been hit out on interstate, and they dropped him right in there. And this was Martin Prechtel, his first time at this camp. And so we did ceremony for the bear that day. We've buried the bear on the grounds. It's become part of our communal mythology. And Miguel Rivera was here, and a couple times we thought, well, let's go see if we can remember where we buried the bear. We've not been able to find it, and finally says, oh, of course not. You know, it's So the bear is a part of our collective mythology here. 28 years worth of men's conference history. You know, we could spend 28 years just talking about that. But it was a poet. It was a poet who brought that. And I want to follow up on Thomas's statement. This is how I describe it. A poet, through his poetry, expresses his personal mythology. So when we read someone else's poetry, we're looking or we're feeling his mythology, and does it mix with ours? So a poet expresses his personal mythology. The stories that Danny and Martin tell express our communal mythology. And the rituals we do, the ritual expresses the mythology of the personal, of the communal, and the spiritual worlds. And that's why it is so important, as Tom said, what is important about these conferences? Poetry, story, and ritual. That's why they've continued for 28 years, and I hope to God they continue for another 28.
Okay. I guess I'm carrying the West Coast and the Mendocino conferences. My first one was probably 28 or 29 years ago. I can't quite figure it out. Walked in to a redwood forest, and there was Robert Bly and James Hillman and Terry Dobson and Michael Mead. And Hillman took a Greek god every day. Each day of the week we took a different Greek god, and between Robert and James, They explored how the Greek God manifests in our leaders today or not, and Robert had some things to say about that. How the Greek God would walk, how painters would deal with these, and it was like a week-long Chautauqua advanced seminar in mythology and poetry, and I was like a stranger in paradise. I had finally found my people, my tribe. I'm serious about that. And I didn't say a word the whole conference, just to my small group. I was totally blown away. But our job was to go home and work on the material that you got. Now, they never spoke that initiations were happening. That word didn't come in for years, initiation, but it was occurring every time we gathered there. You know, you were changed, you were threatened, it was life-altering if you worked with it. Men that I met in Mendocino are deeply in my life to this day. There's a man in the room who melts my heart. I used to wake up the camp with bells, a bunch of bells in one hand, and I would go to a corner of the camp, and then I would sing to wake them up. And the second year I got to the end of the camp, and there was Robert putting on his pants, and he says, I want to come with you. I said, well, Robert, they're all awake. He says, well, let's do it tomorrow. So the next morning, got Robert, and he got his bouzouki, which was never tuned, but that was all right. And we got another guy to sort of guide us, and Robert and I went from little cabin to little cabin, little cabin, and the job was each person, when we would see them sleeping there, and we took turns giving a poem to a particular poem to that body in that cocoon or whatever. Everybody's in sleeping bags, so you never knew who would wake up, truly. And so we did this, and we got dizzier and dizzier and dizzier as we went through. By the time we had awakened, we didn't know where we were. But then, and here's the payoff, for several years, the teaching would come when we would walk back, the two of us, and we would discuss the poems, you know, what worked and what didn't. And now, Doug, you know, when you said that poem in that Rilke line about the powerful South, I don't think you know what that means. Now, what I really meant when I translated that poem, this was pure gold, pure gold, pure gold. Now, he was a fierce teacher, as many of you know, fierce teacher. And one year, I had swallowed Rumi. I mean, I was mainlining Rumi. I could speak it for hours, beautifully. And the end of this one morning, why, Robert was quite blown away with the way I was laying out the Rumi poems. Now, is the word, Martin, is it geish? When you put this...
Yes, geish.
A geish. Yeah, geish. And a geish was like one of these things like, well, I'm going to challenge you that for 1 year and a day, you mustn't do this. And if you accepted that, geish, then you could lay back on the person that laid it on you and say, oh, okay, I'll do that if in 1 year and a day you don't do this. I won't tell you what I laid on Robert. It's not appropriate. But he laid on me that for 1 year and a day I could not do any Rumi poetry in front of more than 5 or 6 people. And do you know how often in the course of 1 year the teachings of Rumi comes up? Huh? So almost every day I had to bless Robert and curse Robert. Yeah. So 1 year and a day pass, we're back in Mendocino, we get out of our cars, we meet, and he gives me this, did you do it? Yes, I did. And he says, well, I did too, you asshole. It's true. It's true. So generally we got along really well in all the conferences, and I owe so much to him. He's held my behind all over the countryside, aiding and abetting him. And of course, working with Robert, when he would get in a jam, he would suddenly elbow me and say, let's sing. So, as you guys know, you have to constantly have your arms around the whole community, taking the pulse. What's happening? How do we get out of this mess? So one morning in this room, and I'll get off of this, but one morning in this room, something was coming up strong and strong and strong, and I was mining it, and I said, oh man, I've never done this, but I think this could really work. And I stood up and it was just before lunch, and I started to teach this thing, and Robert, as only Robert can, says, I hate that shit. Now, this was a blow that came in off of this side. And I had a choice in that moment, in this room, either to say, oh, yes, okay, you're right, or, and I said in this room, Robert, I do not choose to be shamed by you today. That was his teaching. This is what he would teach. If you're going into shame, don't curl up, stand up, raise your head, get taller if you possibly can, and say enough. And I'm saying this because it was one of those moments in the history of the conference where like two dads or two fathers really got into it. And that's just the way it was. And walking out of the hall, men said, well, Doug, how you doing? I said, I'm fine. How's the other guy? So we walked and talked in the afternoon, and we agreed finally that I know music and he knows poetry. And the words that I put on my song, he hated that shit. He didn't hate the song. He didn't hate the music. He hated my words. And he's a poet, so why not? So all praise to Robert Bly and the men's work and the teachings. I need to say one more thing, that everywhere we went, Robert would bring in men of brilliance burning with new ideas who would challenge us. I was around in Mendocino for Maladoma's first men's conference. Robert Moore's up in the Seattle area. Martin Prechtel roaming in with the big boots and the knife down to his knees. Holy shit. And on and on. I could name all of these guys, and I won't for now, but all praise to Robert to follow his edges. He never brought in people that made him comfortable. So that's it.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, I'd like to just follow on with what Doug was saying. He was talking about Rumi and being introduced to Rumi through this work. And, it often seems like, we're sitting up here in the woods and there's 50 of us and what does that mean for the larger culture? It can seem a little futile. But, when these conferences started, the most read poet, the most purchased poet in America was Rod McKuen. I've looked at clouds from both sides now. And today, the most read poet in America is Jalaluddin Rumi. So there's been some deepening of the larger culture because of some things that have happened, in this room and rooms like it.
That's right. Yeah.
My connection to this was actually, I was with, she was my woman at the time. She's still my woman. She's my wife now, but and so she and some of her friends, kind of decided to get together and have, kind of a good, feminist women's group on Sunday mornings and have breakfast together and abandon us men. And like, whimpering, hungry puppies, we we ended up saying, well, if they're going to get together, we'll get together and have breakfast too. So one of the men in that original men's group is Craig Ungerman, sitting right over here. And one of the other men in that group, who's no longer with us, one day brought to that breakfast an article from New Age magazine. It was an interview with a Minnesota poet named Robert Bly, and he was talking about the loss of initiation and the story of Iron John. And it completely electrified our group. And so somehow we started digging into the idea of masculinity. What is it? I mean, we were just having breakfast originally, but somehow that got us started. And somebody dug up this weird, goofy chapbook poem called "Men Don't Dance in America." And we read the damn thing and we weeped into our eggs, And then Robert Bly was speaking at this Methodist church, and so we all showed up, and as Tim related the story, one of our group, grabbed the sign-up sheet and had no idea what to do with it, so then he went to Craig, who had some organizational skills, and got the whole thing started. Oh, you had, I'm sorry, money, not organizational. So, and that first conference was, as Tim said, just... with the loss of a young man, at the very moment when we're talking about the losses and the grief around the Vietnam War, something did alchemically change us. I'll tell one story of coming back from that conference. I happened to be giving a ride to a man from Northern Ireland and another man from Chile. And so we were on a little country road coming down from Ely, Minnesota, up north here, and a cop car pulled up behind us and turned on his lights. Now, that doesn't mean so much here, but when you're from Northern Ireland and from Pinochet's Chile, being stopped by the cops is kind of a big deal. So they were freaking out a little bit, but... and they didn't know what I was going to do. So we'd been working with Terry Dobson, who was an Aikido master that week, and we were just so full of the energy of this kind of conference and that kind of deep, ancient ancestral masculinity, And so I remember the cop was walking up to our car, and he was doing his cop thing where they flip the hat on and they unbuckle the gun and they prepare to dominate you, to be alpha dog, because that's how cops manage the situation. And I had the window rolled down, and I had my hands on the steering wheel so he could see I wasn't a threat to him. But as he walked up to my window, and I remember just turning to him and just like pulling up all the energy, from the earth, from this place, and of that conference. And the cop actually jumped back from the window. And not like he was intimidated, but he just got real polite and real like, oh, I just wanted to tell you your taillight's out. You should get it fixed. It could be dangerous. The thing I was going to talk about too was being in a small men's group, and then what happened after that, because after that conference, we couldn't let it go. We had to retouch this energy. I'm still in a men's group that's been meeting for I don't know how 25 years or something like that. We formed a group that met once a month in a YMCA building, and we started trying to do this kind of work ourselves. We started bringing in stories and making ritual, and a lot of it was pretty messy, and a lot of it was failures, but a lot of it was beautiful failures. You come to this conference, and you sit in the presence of a teacher like Martin Shaw or Danny or Robert or James Hillman or Martine Prechtel or Malidoma Somé, and those are very powerful people. And it's like, jumping on the back of a firebird. It really does change you. But there's also something about riding that small shaggy pony and doing that work as well. That's equally as important and equally as transformative. And that's what being in some of those small men's groups is, I think. How many? Can I just see a show of hands? How many men are in a men's group of some kind? Yeah, that's great. I encourage you, if you're not in one, to find some kindred spirits and share that. So.
And always start your men's group with a poem.
Well, I think I met Doug at my first men's conference, or the second one up in the Northwest, when Michael Meade and Robert Bly were doing men's conferences up in Washington State. Thinking about Robert's fierceness, which I've learned and taken a lot from him, fierceness into my body. It doesn't seem like a good idea to be a cripple and have a bad attitude. You start biting people's heads off, and they just don't take care of you. So when I first came in the presence of Robert, and he was at his fiercest, I was definitely not at my fiercest. I remember there was a guy that I vaguely knew who was a Freudian psychotherapist in the audience, and every time he stood up, I would roll my eyes, And he, like the third time he stood up, Robert says, "You need to sit down and shut up. You're too much in your head." Wow. And he almost left, but a bunch of people talked him out of leaving. And he stayed. It turned out to be good for him. That same conference, and this is part of what I want to talk about, is the gift that Robert gave me over and over and over again. The gift that Robert gave to me. It was towards the end of the conference, and I read a poem. I don't remember the name of the poet. I've kind of blanked the whole thing out. And I said I'd like to read a poem, and Robert asked me who wrote it, and I said the name. He said, "Never heard of it." And that should have told me, But I read the poem, and everybody was quiet, and it got done, and Robert said, "That's the worst fucking poem I ever heard in my life." And all the blood drained out of my head, and I thought I was going to die. If I could have run, I would. And shortly after that, things broke up, and Robert came over, and he sat down beside me. And he put his arm around me, and he said, "I'm sorry, but I had to do that because all these other men need to see that you're just one of them." Do you understand? You get it? And nobody in my life had ever given me that. before. You know, I got passing grades all through junior high and high school by doing nothing. Robert wouldn't give me a fucking passing grade unless I fucking earned it. And I loved him for that. Because he saw me as a man. And I became a better man in his eyes. I guess the last thing I want to say, well, you know, Robert gave a lot of advice over the years. and some of it was pretty damn good. I remember one year he was talking about being trustworthy with your woman. He said, if you think you'll be home by 9 o'clock, say you'll be home by 10. That turned out to be really good advice for me. Anyway, it was towards the end of the first conference, the night before the end, when we used to do carnival. Everyone had made masks. Everyone was stripped to the waist. Bodies were painted in colors. Guys were drumming and dancing. And somebody called the cops. And the cops came, and Robert went out, Michael Mead went out and talked to the cops. And we all just kind of sat there waiting to find out if they were really going to try to take us all to jail. I think these guys looked in and saw us all in our masks and realized that they'd bitten off more than they could chew. But they made a deal with Robert and Michael. They said, you can either get the men to stop drumming and singing and making so much noise, or we'll take the two of you to jail. And Bly and Mead came back in and offered us the choice. They said, if you want to keep drumming and singing, we'll go to jail. But if you want us to stay here with you, then we got to quiet it down. So we decided to quiet it down. But they were serious. They were serious. They were willing to go to jail so that we could continue our celebration. And that's the kind of commitment that I've learned from Robert right down the line. That's all I got.
Well, we know Robert's life is like that poem, I live my life in growing orbits. And his orbit became so vast that it even, extended past anything that was happening in America and out into Europe. And I'm a relatively young man. I'm 40, just. And so the real kind of crucible of energy happening in the late 80s and early 90s kind of passed me by. But it would have been in 1995, so the thing would have been in full blast over here, but was quieter in England. And it's a story some of you will be familiar with, where I'd ended up, marriage had gone horribly wrong, and I'd ended up living in a men's hostel, which is like little rooms that guys live in, and they don't have a kitchen, they don't have anywhere where you can cook. There isn't even a communal room, it's just a room. And it was above a garage, where every day they brought in old cars and they got the welds. You got constantly the sound of welding going on underneath as these cars get dismantled and put back together. And there's just this quiet succession of sobbing broken men in these tiny little rooms. And all I had at that point was a library card to go to the library, and it was during there that I found Iron John. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't have any kind of context for it. I didn't know the movement it had come out of. I knew nothing. I just knew the book. And instantly what happened was this sense that I'd come across a kind of esoteric university education contained in the book. I knew instantly it was a very generous book. And it was full of leads if you had the cojones to follow them. You know, you could have nothing in your life but the $8 to buy the book, and he was offering you the get out of jail card, as far as I was concerned. And what happened is that night, my prison cell became a hermit's hut. That's what happened. That was the first gift. He changed the context of what I was experiencing. And as I read the book, The Descent of Ashes, Katabasis, I was like, I'm living this experience. All I had at that point was Robert's book and a Rembrandt sketch of a wounded lion stuck on the wall. That was it. So time passes, and I got drawn into something called wilderness rites of passage work, which is going out into the wild for 4 days and nights. Many of you are familiar with it. And in Iron John, Robert and his revival of the word initiation. Initiation is a very wide word. It's a broad church. And the kind of initiation that Robert focuses on in Iron John is not really the nature of the wilderness fast. It is far more about collective considered men's rituals together. It's a slightly different flavor. So unbelievably, I didn't necessarily make the connections between Iron John and the wilderness work, and very other few people did in my area. Part of that process involved me living outside for 4 years, and I lived in a tent, and this was blissfully before the internet, blissfully before mobile phones, blissfully before any of that. So it really was an absolutely different experience. It was very cold, and I had a little tape recorder. And before I'd left, someone had given me these cassettes of something called Men and the Life of Desire, Hillman, Mead, and Bly. But it was so cold where I lived that the tape recorder would only work for 10 minutes a day before the cold just got into it and the batteries couldn't work anymore. So every night I slept with the batteries down my front, wrapped under all these animal skins. So in the morning I would reach out and get the tape recorder, put the batteries in, and for 10 minutes I could hear Robert. 10 minutes, and then okay, that's enough. So I would go out, collect the kindling, make the fire, brew the coffee, and begin my day, begin my practice. For 4 years, that was my practice, day in, day out. No lover warmed my bed. Very few people came to visit. That was it, me in the black tent. So, in other words, I am one of several million men that Robert has mentored by distance. By distance. And that would have been more than enough, were it not for the fact that in 2006, so about 10 years, 11 years later, I meet the guy. And of course, I meet him, as many of you know, in the men's room, in the John, the Iron John. Yeah. So this is the true story. So I'm invited over because of my, sterling work with the young men. I'm invited over to the Great Mother Conference, his other conference. So I get to Portland Airport, and as some of you know, in the middle of the night, I woke up in the airport and I was getting robbed. And there was an African American man with his hand right in the center of my bag, pulling out all my stuff, and he greeted me as I woke with this immortal line, "Thank God you're awake." And he tried to turn the thing on a dime, and he said, "I'm a lawyer." As the crack sweat dripped down his face, he said, "I'm a lawyer, something terrible has happened to my family, and if I could just have your passport and a few dollars, I could get on another plane and get back to the South." And as he said it, he knew, I knew he was lying. We all knew this fabrication existed, but the fabrication lifted us from the possibility of violence. It lifted us, so we played the game back and forth. And in the end, he left. So that's my first experience of America, my first conversation in America. A few hours later, I'm dropped off at Portland, and it was an edgy experience because I'd had to spend the night out on the streets and stuff. So I get there, and I think, well, I'll just gather myself in the men's room. So I'm at the cubicle, the pecker is out, and this shadow falls over me, and whoever it is at the next cubicle is giving it a bit of spray, if you catch my drift, and I'm not enjoying it, and I'm moving, and I'm moving, and I'm moving. Holy fuck, it's Robert Bly. You must understand, friends, this is like meeting Howling Wolf or Jimi Hendrix or something. It's utterly unreal, and the first thing I ever saw was his proud Norwegian stork. Mine, of course, is withering on the vine. Withering away. It's gone back inside. I'm changing sex. And I did a foolish thing, but out of utter panic. I engaged him in conversation, which was a mistake because it didn't end well for me in the way you can imagine. He was brisk, I think is the phrase. So I staggered out, and time passes, and he was very generous to me. And a few years later, actually, I invited Robert and at least three of the guys on this panel to come over to England. And this is when I got to know him in a slightly different light, and his light and shade, shall we say, because I'd managed to get the London Times, which is an extremely old English newspaper, to come to Minneapolis to interview him, to promote the festival that had taken a year to organise. And I was very excited about this, and I knew that all the real promotion for the event depended on this interview. And if it was a good one, and they were going to give it a full page, then that would be the thing that finally sweetened the deal and got us possibly to breaking even and would save my financial life and many others. So the Times go to meet Robert. They interview him, and he just says, "Well, I fucking hate the English. Fucking hell. I can't remember where I'm going. Fuck 'em, fuck 'em, fuck 'em, fuck 'em." That was essentially the promotional campaign for my festival. Buggy. Bye-bye. And he was gone, So that was another side. And I thought, you fucking wanker. You fucking wanker. And, I had to go and visit him from the airport. But I was, I don't give a fuck at certain points. You can be Moses and steam will come from my head. And I felt so hurt by what he'd done. But I suddenly realized as soon as I met him as an old man, he didn't know what he'd done. There was no strategy to it. It was just Robert at that moment in that day. And then an hour later, you would have got someone else. So gradually my own red mist settled, and I realized that we could have a debate and a conversation. And over time, during that event, he proved very generous. I mean, here's some little details about his generosity. He got a good fee, but when he knew that there were other people on board behind the scenes that couldn't afford to come, he came to me privately and said, "I want you to cut my fee into thirds and give it to other people." It's important that that's known about him. It's important that it's known that when I did, because of his interview, make a humongous loss on that experience, through people here, that word got back to him, and I received a check from him and from others. So it's a mixed bag. That's what I'm trying to say. And I feel very strongly that as Robert heads back into the dreaming, we never forget his teeth. We never forget his teeth, because that's part of dealing with a storm. And that's how, as a weather pattern, I've always viewed him. So I'm kind of the last guy, I suppose, on the bench, talking about this great journey that has taken place. And I know as at my age now, I can't afford to live on stories about Hillman and Mead and Bly in the mid-90s. I was not there. I'm inspired by it, I'm moved by it, but I want to know about the men's work now. Now. And as I look out into a room of people that I'm really growing to love, I see that the room is half empty. And so the reason I'm going to be here this week is really to ask a simple question. Is this still working? Is this still working? Now, we don't need to do that now, but I think it's important somehow as the progression of this, and I've been so fired up by hearing these stories, it's easy for me to get lost in a nostalgia for something I never experienced. So I hope part of my piece here, as your friend and your brother, is to hold that bit about what now. Okay, thank you.
You know, I'd like to, excuse me, I'd like to add one thing to this discussion. This may be evident, I'm not sure, but there, in the history of this thing, there's a divide that comes in the year 1990. That's the year of the publication of Iron John. The stuff that a lot of us have been describing that takes place in the 80s belongs to what was really genuinely an underground movement. I mean, this was not something that was well known by the American public, certainly. And, you know, the police encountering Danny and friends, that was totally strange and off the map. So for a while after 1990 and the best-selling status of Iron John and a couple other things too, including the Bill Moyers Gathering of Men program and a couple of other high-profile media coverages of the men's work, there was a brief time when it was above ground and in the more or less in the limelight. But it went back down again. It went back down again in just in a few years, maybe less than that. So I think we also have to recognize the fact that right now, once again, we are underground. This is below the map again, or below the radar, off the map.
Could I, just before we go any further, thank you for that. What we've got here, which is great, is a few days to brood. You know, that old male quality, brooding. So there doesn't need to be any immediate anything about these questions. Let's actually give ourselves some spaciousness. Really, the point now is for a few more recollections, I think more about Robert and that. But this wider question, I just drop it in now so we've got some time, and there will be time allotted as we go to talk about it further. So, yeah.